The air in the private dining room was heavy, insulated from the frantic noise of Los Angeles outside. It was a space designed for history, paneled in dark, unforgiving mahogany, smelling of ancient leather and the lingering smoke of triumphs past. This was where legends convened, and tonight it was the site of an inevitable collision, a clash between the digital future and the enduring weight of tangible experience. In the corner sat the icon, a silhouette etched into the mythology of cinema. Clint Eastwood, 80 years of life, 60 years behind the camera, a lifetime distilled into the quiet authority of his posture. He wasn't a man who used many words, but when he spoke, the gravity shifted. Across from him, vibrating slightly with kinetic energy and academic confidence, was Julian Hayes. Julian was the definition of the modern auteur: clean lines, expensive fabrication, driven by theory and critique rather than the messy reality of the set. He was 35, highly credentialed, and obsessed with what he termed the relevancy quotient. Julian had arrived armed with spreadsheets and buzzwords, ready to lecture the man who had effectively invented American iconography. The meeting had started as a polite professional courtesy, but Julian, mistaking patience for deference, had swiftly launched his attack. He dissected Eastwood's most celebrated works, not for narrative structure or emotional impact, but through the narrow clinical lens of modern academic critique. His voice, modulated to sound intensely serious, filled the quiet room with a torrent of jargon. He spoke of systemic flaws, outdated perspectives, and the necessity for deconstructionist cinema. For 15 minutes, Julian performed a thesis defense, detailing how the foundational simplicity of Eastwood's storytelling was now a detriment, a moral liability in the complex, nuanced landscape of the new millennium. He argued that the modern audience, sophisticated and culturally aware, demanded a cinema that self-critiqued, that apologized for the past, and that actively dismantled established heroism. He held up his phone, citing Twitter trends and critical reviews from obscure online journals, using them as proof of his definitive grasp on the cultural zeitgeist. "The age of the rugged individual, Mr. Eastwood," Julian pronounced, leaning forward, his voice gaining the patronizing cadence of a professor addressing a slow student. "That age is over. Audiences need accountability. They need complexity that reflects the inherent contradiction of existence. Your characters are too simple. They are moral absolutes. They lack the necessary, frankly, woke ambiguity that true art requires today." He finished his monologue with a slight, confident smile, expecting a defensive rebuttal, a justification of old methods. He expected a retreat. Eastwood did not move. He did not flinch. He did not debate the semantics of woke or relevance. He simply lowered the rocks glass of whiskey he held, the movement slow and deliberate, the clink of glass against wood echoing like a gunshot. Julian, basking in the silence he mistakenly interpreted as defeat, straightened his Italian silk tie. Then the legend began to speak. His voice was gravel, worn smooth by time and command, but it held a quiet, resonant power that instantly dwarfed Julian's performance. It wasn't loud, but it penetrated. "I've spent 60 years finding the shot," Eastwood began, his gaze steady, fixed not on Julian, but slightly past him, as if addressing the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten film crews. 60 years standing in the dust, freezing in the snow, sweating under lights that could melt glass. 60 years dealing with weather that won't cooperate, budgets that collapse, and actors who forget their lines. He paused, letting the weight of that lived experience settle heavily on the polished table. "You talk about complexity," he continued, the words coming out slow, heavy, like stones being dropped into a well. "You talk about contradiction. You talk about nuance discovered in a seminar room. You look at my work and you see simplicity. I see survival." Eastwood shifted slightly, a movement that commanded more attention than Julian's entire presentation. "You use words like problematic because you live in a world where everything can be edited, revised, and canceled with the push of a button," he stated flatly. "You live in a digital safety net, Julian. You theorize about danger from a position of absolute comfort. You talk about the gaze of the camera, but you've never been the one standing behind it when the sun is setting fast. The whole day's work resting on hitting one perfect mark, right now, with no second chances." The core of the argument began to sharpen, moving from craft to philosophy. "That, Julian, is where the real complexity lies. not in the theories you read in a textbook written by someone who never made a film. The complexity is in the execution. The contradiction is loving the story enough to risk total failure, publicly in front of millions, and doing it again the next day. Julian tried to interject, opening his mouth to pivot back to socio-political relevance, but Eastwood held him with a look that instantly froze the younger man's practiced defense. You critique the morality of a man fighting for survival in the desert because he doesn't adhere to the ethical standards of a modern, well-funded university campus, Eastwood observed, the comparison brutal in its accuracy. You confuse the need for authenticity with the need for affirmation. You want films that tell people what to think, structured perfectly to pass a social audit. I want films that show people who they are, stripped bare. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble, forcing Julian to listen intently. You mentioned my characters are too simple, too black and white. You know why? He didn't wait for an answer. Because when a man is facing a life or death choice, when the stakes are real, tangible, immediate, nuance disappears. Morality becomes incredibly simple. Do you pull the trigger, or do you die? Do you keep the promise, or do you become the villain? That is the human condition, Julian. Everything else is academic chatter. Julian mumbled something about the importance of challenging the viewer's preconceptions. Eastwood cut him off instantly. You want to challenge preconceptions? Try challenging a crew of 300 people to believe in your vision when the financing is falling apart and the schedule is impossible. Try challenging the physics of light. Try making something beautiful and true out of raw, resistant reality. That's a challenge. He took a slow sip of his drink, allowing the full weight of his accumulated experience to crush the younger man's carefully constructed intellectual shield. The difference between us, Eastwood articulated, his voice now a final, definitive judgment, is that you are terrified of making a mistake that might look bad on paper. I understand that the only real mistakes are the ones you don't learn from, and the only real failure is never trying to make something honest in the first place. He placed the glass down one last time, the sound final. You lecture me about the dirt under my fingernails, Eastwood concluded, looking Julian directly in the eye, his expression unreadable. But you've never held a shovel. The statement was not a burn. It was an execution. It wasn't a complex rebuttal. It was the simple, undeniable wisdom of experience shattering the fragile armor of theory. Julian Hayes, the man who had spent his life analyzing the texture of hardship, suddenly understood the difference between a textbook and a life lived. He had criticized the scratches on the paint without ever knowing the feel of the metal beneath. The room fell silent again, but this time, the tension was gone, replaced by the profound humiliation of the defeated. Julian's sophisticated vocabulary deserted him. He tried to speak, tried to retrieve a coherent argument, but all that came out was a strangled, impotent stammer. He realized with crushing clarity that every word he had spoken was borrowed, theoretical, and utterly hollow in the presence of genuine creation. Within hours, the core phrase, the simple, devastating truth of the shovel, leaked. It wasn't leaked by Eastwood, who never sought validation, but by someone present who recognized the magnitude of the moment. It hit the industry like a seismic shockwave. Initially, the academic circles rallied around Julian, calling the quote anti-intellectual and a typical boomer rejection of progress. But outside that insular echo chamber, the quote resonated with an immediate universal force. People who actually built things, carpenters, engineers, small business owners, nurses, and most notably, working filmmakers, understood the essence of the criticism. It wasn't a dismissal of intelligence. It was a demand for authenticity. It was a brutal reminder that commentary is cheap, but creation demands a tangible toll. Julian Hayes quickly became a cautionary tale. His meticulously curated image of critical superiority collapsed under the weight of one simple, undeniable metaphor. His future projects, heavily dependent on narrative complexity and academic approval, lost their luster and, soon after, their funding. The industry decided they didn't want the lecture. They wanted the story. They wanted the man who had actually held the shovel. The legacy of the confrontation was not just the end of one young director's career, but a cultural reassertion of the value of mastery over mere critique. It proved that sometimes the most profound philosophical argument is expressed not through complex jargon, but through the hard-won economy of brutal truth. The moment served as a testament to the enduring authority of the man who learned to make a living by making things real. who understood that true art requires dirt under the fingernails and the courage to fail publicly. The world needs more people like this. Share if you agree.